Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting a sunset cityscape scene. I'm painting it on Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper. It's taped to my board and my board's at an angle of about 45 degrees. There will be a photograph from Pixabay linked to this and a bit of an extra discussion about planning this painting on Patreon if anyone's interested. I'm using my large Ron Ranson Pro Art Harkey brush and I wet the page all over, and now I'm creating my sunset sky. First of all, I used raw sienna, then I followed up streaking some beautiful burnt sienna across the page, and the next colour that I shall put in is some red to really intensify the sunset, and this is alizarin crimson. All my paints are Cotman student quality paints, straight from the tube. I like to use them straight from the tube. I think it gives me a much more sort of vibrant and richer look to my painting. I've now put a mixture of Payne's Grey and Indigo across the sky, gradually darkening it up. While the paper's still wet in my sky, I can play around with it and make adjustments as I go. Trying to introduce some slightly darker cloud shapes into the sunset. And across the horizon line, I've just begun to indicate distant, blurry mountains or hills. I'm turning my board around 90 degrees so the paint stops running down the page and it will run across the page a bit more. You can tip and tilt your board in any direction you like according to what sort of direction you want your clouds to run in. Now this is my 3/4 inch flat brush and I'm feathering it through my clouds just to spread the paint out a little bit more and to give some nice sort of feathery streaks of colour and dark through my sunset to add a bit more variety to the brush strokes. I've turned it back the right way and continuing with the process of feathering this brush through, dragging some of the colour across the page, sort of trying to indicate the perspective of the sunset and clouds coming in over my cityscape. And now the sky's just about done. I'm going to leave it alone because if I keep going with it, I will overwork it. So I'm going into my really rich paint, a mixture of indigo and Payne's Grey, and I'm going to put in an underpainting for my cityscape, which is mostly in silhouette apart from a few lights. And I'm pulling up some vertical shapes just to get some sort of indications and suggestions of high-rise buildings coming up towards the sunset. I'm not going to put any detail in, but I think it'll make a nice background for once I begin to block in my more solid cityscape skyline. I've swapped between my small Ron Ranson Pro Art Harkey brush and my large brush and also my 3/4 inch flat brush, depending on the kind of brush stroke that I want, the kind of edge that I want. If I want it to be a little bit of a sort of a more blurry edge, I'll use the Harkey brush. For a flatter edge, straighter edge, I'll use the flat brush. And if you notice here, the direction of my brush strokes is either vertical or horizontal in this urban skyline area. And this produces quite a nice contrast between the very organic, sort of flowing, diffused brush strokes in the sky. It helps to distinguish the land from the sky. It's quite pale here. I'll be putting in much darker, richer paint once this is completely dried out. But for the time being, I'm just building up this kind of basic geometric lower part of the painting, ready to finish it off once the painting is completely dry. And I think that will do for my underpainting. I shall now leave it to dry completely and then come back and carry on with it. So I've left it for a few hours. It's fully dry and it's dried nice and pale and interesting, and I think I don't really need to do too much more to it. But what I am going to do is to put in some nice strong dark buildings. So I'm going to be using my flat brush for this, and a very rich, almost straight from the tube consistency mixture of Payne's grey with a touch of indigo in it to take it, more to the blue side than the black side. And I shall start to work on my skyline, and this time I'm going to be a little bit more particular about my edges and my shapes. I'm still going to stick with horizontal and vertical brush strokes, but this time I'm going to try and sort of use the brush carefully so that with one or two strokes I can pull down a whole building in one or two goes, to keep it fresh, and to really indicate that nice sharp urban skyline. So as I work across my cityscape, the lower part of my painting, I'm dipping into the rich paint time and time again, but I'm allowing it to run out a bit on my brush, so you can see that some of my buildings are a little darker than others, and this helps to suggest layers of buildings, so not just a very simple single layer. I'm trying to suggest that there's a city sort of stretching off into the distance. These flat brushes like this are really useful for this kind of painting where it's sort of a semi-abstract and suggested cityscape like this. They are sort of otherwise known as one-stroke brushes, and they're really useful for keeping things nice and fresh and clean when you're trying to paint sort of skyscrapers and buildings like this from the distance. So I'm nearly there now. I'm quite happy with the way it's looking. I've got a bit of a lean on some of my buildings, but I can correct that a bit later quite easily with my flat brush and just sort of straighten out some of the lines here and there. What's important to me now is to build up this layer of dark across the foreground coming off across the tape, so that I can then leave this layer to dry and then come back in and finish it off with a few lights and windows and those sorts of details. I think all I want to do now is to make sure that the edge of the tips of my flat brush are really smooth and together, and then I'm going to use the tips of the flat brush to put in all kinds of sort of vertical lines so that we've got street lights, aerials, towers, all sorts of things, something and nothing, just things that kind of indicate and break up from that very geometric lines and blocks that I've created for the skyscrapers. Bit of something and nothing, creating maybe some sort of towers and slightly different shapes for the skyline. This just refines things a little bit more, and just before we paint in the windows and the lights, I think this just brings little bit more sort of, not quite reality, but a sort of suggestion of reality to the skyline. And I think that'll do. I can make any adjustments to it later. I'm now going to leave it to completely dry. It's the next day, and there's quite a lot of light coming in through the windows. It's not quite as pale as this, but I'm really pleased with how it's turned out. Now what I'm going to do is just spend a little while finishing it off with a very small flat brush and some white gouache. So I've got it fairly thick, and I'm going to just dot it into some of the buildings to indicate lights on in the buildings, and to hopefully draw the eye to this little area here that's my focal point. So there'll be less lights in other areas, but I will put lights across the whole skyline. In keeping with the geometric shape of my buildings and skyscrapers, I'm putting my little dots for windows in either horizontal or vertical lines and rows, which indicates the windows more clearly than just randomly dotting and dashing little spots of light. This actually indicates the buildings more strongly. I can actually indicate a closer building in the foreground overlapping a distant building by making the lights slightly larger as well. I won't show all of this as it can get a little bit boring. It can be quite time consuming, stopping and checking and making sure things look okay. And then if things are a little bit bright, I can blur them out a bit in places by just going over the white gouache with a damp brush. Now I'm happy with this. I think that's done. I could put some birds in the sky, but I'm going to resist. Please feel free to do so and to make any adjustments in your own paintings if you try this, or try any different colours. It doesn't have to be a sunset. It could be anything really, but it's a nice, easy way to create a very interesting silhouetted skyline. So now we can see it with the tape removed, and I'm quite pleased with how effectively the sort of flowing organic sky works against the very blocky and geometric skyline. I think it's also worth noting that when you are painting something like this, that you want a wash brush, something quite soft like a Haki brush or maybe a squirrel mop for the sky, and then a sort of synthetic stiffer flat brush makes quick work of the buildings. So I hope that was helpful. Thanks so much for watching. Please give us a thumbs up, and also consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And if you click the bell icon, you'll be notified every time I post. And lastly, thanks so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.